Headless components have emerged as a modern pattern that is rapidly gaining traction in front-end development. Their versatility, adaptability, and accessibility advantages offered by this pattern make headless components an excellent choice when constructing accessible components. We'll take the tabs component and create a headless version using Radix. And I want to take a minute here to explain why I'm having you implement a headless version of the tabs. I intentionally had us implement a manual implementation because I wanted you to learn how to read through the specifications, how to apply proper ARIA attributes, and how to wire up keyboard interactions. That's a really important skill to learn when you're implementing a custom component pattern. But I've also seen this emerging headless component pattern kind of gaining popularity maybe over the last couple years or so. And I think it's a kind of gives you best of both worlds because when there's not a native HTML equivalent or you need to implement your own custom component, it can be kind of difficult because if there is a native HTML equivalent, a lot of times styling it is really tricky or finicky. And if there isn't and you have to implement your own custom component, that can be hard in itself because making sure you get functionality right is tricky, or and then making sure it's accessible and then styling it. So this emerging headless component pattern I'm seeing, I think, kind of bridges that gap and makes it so that you can style it and brand it the way you want, but it also gives you baked in accessibility by default. And so I think learning the manual way can help you like appreciate this headless component pattern. And so we're going to be using Radix to implement it, but there are other component libraries out there like, let's see, Headless UI for using Tailwind CSS. That's a good one. There's Reach UI, which is kind of like the OG of the headless component libraries. And then there's, oh gosh, I think React ARIA might be by the Adobe team. Yeah, so there's a couple of different options out there that you can use. All right, so with the explanation out of the way, let's go to Code Sandbox and open up tab.jsx and copy the code that is in the lesson manuscript, and let's port it over here. Okay, that. Alrighty. And if you notice, the preview in Code Sandbox resembles the exact same UI that was displayed for our initial tabs implementation. So I'm going to kind of do reverse of what I did with the manual implementation, where I'm going to provide you all the code up front, and then we're going to retrace our steps and understand what each element does. And let's start off by learning the anatomy of a Radix tabs component. And so actually, let's go to the Radix documentation first. So Radix is just a component library. They actually have a couple different things that they provide, like icons, which is what we used when we wired up the error messaging for the text input component. But primitives is probably their most popular package that they provide. And so if you go into get started, and you can see that they provide tons of components here. Radio group, popover, menu bar. Obviously, we are going to be focusing on the tabs, but just wanted to give you a quick overview of what the documentation looks like and how you can kind of reference it later going forward. And so, yeah, so the Radix tabs component, it kind of consists of 4 elements. And the first element is the tabs primitive root, which contains all the tab component parts and acts as the container for the elements. Then we have the tabs primitive list, and this contains the triggers that are aligned along the edge of the active content. This is what the ARIA specs would refer to as the tab list element. Third, we have the actual trigger, and this is the button that activates its associated content. So this is what's known as the tab element. And then last but not least, we have the tabs primitive content, and this just contains the content associated with each trigger, or is also known as the tab panel element. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of the structure of what a Radix tabs component consists of. So if we go back to the ARIA tabs pattern page, I want us to compare it to our new implementation and inspect how Radix takes care of all the specifications for us by default. Okay, and so let's actually scroll up and go to the keyboard interaction section. And so, yeah, so we're going to look at this here. So if we remember, and let's actually open up this in a new window. All right, so here's our component. So let's go ahead and test some keyboard interactions. And first, we're going to do the tab. If I press tab, notice that it goes straight to the first tab in the list. And if I press tab again, it goes to our tab content, which is exactly how it functioned in our last implementation. And if I press shift tab to go back, takes us back to our first tab. Now if I go and press, let's say I do the right arrow, notice that it goes to the second tab. I press the right arrow again, does the same thing. Right arrow one more time, it roves us back to the first tab. And now I'm going to do the left arrow. Again, pressing left arrow now roves us to the end. So I see we have that roving tab index kind of implemented by default. Press left arrow, it takes us there. And then one more time to the front. And there's actually some bonus keyboard interactions we get that we didn't implement in the last, in the manual implementation because they were optional. But if I press the home key, or I'm sorry, let me press the end key first. Notice that it takes us to the last tab in the list. And then if I press the home key, it takes us to the first tab in the list. So just by using Radix, we kind of get 2 extra keyboard functionalities, out of the box. All right. So now that we've looked at the keyboard interaction parts of the specs, let's go ahead and scroll down to the role states and properties part. And because I want us to properly vet that the accessibility properties are being applied correctly. And so I want us to review each of the bullet points outlined in this section and then compare it to the HTML that is generated by Radix in the DOM. And so the bullet points we won't go through each one in consecutive order because we kind of got to jump around a bit based on where the elements are in the DOM, but we'll cover each of these points. So let's go ahead and inspect. Let's see. Okay. And okay, let's look at this first element here. So the following code block that is generated, this is the tabs primitive list. This is what's generated from that. And it covers the following criteria from the specs. And so the first criteria is that the element that serves as a container for the tabs has role tab list. Okay. And so if we go here, and let me actually bump this up. Speaking of accessibility, let's make it easy to see. So this element here has role tab list. Okay. And then if we go back to our specs, another thing is that, the tab list element has a label provided by ARIA label. Okay, so going back here, notice that we have our ARIA label right here, jazz musician quotes, being properly wired up. And then the last thing we'll look at is, going back to our specs here, the default value of ARIA orientation for a tab list element is horizontal. If we go back to our specs, we see, to our DOM here, we'll see that the ARIA orientation is in fact set to horizontal. So there's 3 of our criteria already outlined here. So the next code block we'll take a look at is what is generated by the tabs primitive trigger. And just to go back to Code Sandbox really quick, so this element here is what generates the HTML that we're looking at right now, which is this button. And so the first one of the bullet points that we want to look at from the spec is that each element that serves as a tab has role tab and is contained within the element with role tab list. Okay, so this one right here. So now, if we go back here, each element that serves a tab has role tab. So notice that this is a button element, same element that we use in our manual implementation, has a role of tab, and is contained within the element with role tab list. This button is contained within the tab list. All right. So the next criteria we want to look at is that each element with role tab has a property ARIA controls, referring to its associated tab panel element. All right, let's see. Where is that in here? Here we go. So that bullet point is what we're looking at. So if we go back and look at this, notice that we have ARIA controls set to Radix :R1 content -stan, right? And if let me make this a little bit bigger here. We scroll down, notice that it points to the ID of Radix R1 content stand. So the ARIA controls of the trigger, here points to the content element here. So that's just like the spec says. And then the last bullet point we'll look at for this particular element is that The active tab element has the state ARIA selected set to true, and all other tab elements have it set to false. All right, so looking at this bullet point right here. And if we notice, we look at this, it has ARIA selected set to true, and all the other ARIA selected are set to false. Now, if I go and click on Charlie Parker here, notice that the DOM updates, and now ARIA selected is set to true for the third tab, but all the other ones are set to false. So that functionality is working correctly. Okay, so the last element we'll inspect is the tab's primitive content. And if you look at it, it's right here in our tabs.jsx file. So we're going to look at what this generates in the DOM. So if we go down here, the first criteria that we're going to look at from the specs is each element that contains a content panel for a tab has role tab panel. Let's see, this one right here. And if we go back, we notice that this, in fact, does have the role tab panel. Yes, and these are the other corresponding tab panels, but they are, notice that there's a display none, so they're not, visibly showing. Okay, and then the last bullet point for the tab spec that we'll take a look at is that each element with role tab panel has the property ARIA labeled by referring to its associated tab element. Okay, so let's see. Each element that has associated tab panel element. Okay, so that means we've gone through each of these bullet points now. And so if we go down here, so each one that has the role tab panel has property ARIA labeled by, and notice that the ARIA labeled by is in fact on this, and that it refers to the associated tab element. Okay, so looking at this second one here, which refers to the second tab, it says Radix -R1 trigger Ella. This ARIA labeled by points, if we go to our trigger now, or our button element, notice that it points to the ID with the same name. Same thing for the third tab. Notice Radix-R1 trigger Charlie points to the ID of the corresponding button that would display that content. And so I wanted to show how to properly vet a component library, because even though these are, there are a lot of component libraries out there, it's still, I think, important to vet the library to make sure that they're implementing the accessibility patterns correctly. And then it also draws a parallel to how we did it with the manual approach. And with that, we've implemented our headless tabs component. I really thought it was important for us to draw the parallels between the manual approach and the headless approach, because it shows that there are different ways you can implement a component pattern. And I also wanted to provide you with an additional tool in your tool belt so that you can make the best choice for you when implementing accessible components.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.